This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Last summer, the last U.S. military flight left Kabul in Afghanistan, ending America's longest war in history. From Iran and Iraq to Afghanistan and Syria, America has invested and engaged in almost every part of the Middle East. As it withdraws from this region, what legacy does it leave behind? What is the state of relations between the U.S. and Middle Eastern countries? And what will U.S. engagement in the region look like in the years to come? To discuss these issues and more for the first part of the program, I'm honored today to be joined by Shuda Nawaz, a distinguished fellow of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council. For the second part of the program, I will also be joined by Professor Faiz Zalant from Kabul University. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the show, Mr. Nawaz. Let's start with U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Some would say the U.S. is withdrawing from this region and shifting its attention to Asia, particularly China. But the U.S. might be reducing its presence in this region, but certainly the U.S. is not leaving entirely from this region, right? So what's the U.S. strategy? What's the U.S. policy toward this region?
That is the question that many of us have been trying to answer for the last few years in particular. And this, as you recall, began with President Obama with his famously announced pivot to the Indo-Pacific, which of course led to a greater collaboration between India and the United States, and then led to the creation of the so-called Quad of Japan, the United States, Australia, and India. But as we know, the United States was unable to withdraw from the Middle East, and it is unlikely to actually withdraw its relationships from the Middle East for many strategic reasons as well as for economic reasons. And I think that is really at the heart of it. At the moment, the world is coping with a change from what used to be almost a unipolar world or a bipolar world during the Cold War in particular, to a world where different poles have emerged and there are different regional interests and emerging economies and countries, including China, including Russia, which is trying to stage a comeback. And the United States will also have to deal with the resurgent Europe that wants to assert its own interests, particularly in dealing with its neighbors to the east. So the United States will have to adjust its focus as well as its engagement with groups as well as countries in these different regions.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Nawaz, speak of the U.S. policy or U.S. presence in the Middle East. The first idea occurred to the mind would probably be the wars. The wars with Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Afghanistan. We talked about that. That's why probably America has been called a country of war. According to one figure, they say U.S. has been at war in 227 out of its 245 years since 1776. Of course, I understand people have issues with this figure. They would say, what's the definition of war? And some of the war probably is not initiated by the United States. But still, people would question, is there any reflection or discussion inside the U.S. why the U.S. is constantly at war?
Well, there is a fair amount of discussion. In fact, because of the two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that occupied so much of the attention of the United States and led to the loss of trillions of dollars of U.S. taxpayers' money, according to the Brown University Costs of War study. There is now what I would call is something called war fatigue in the United States. in the last couple of presidential elections, the issue was not even discussed very actively, except for very quick, short statements by some candidates who said that they would withdraw if they were elected. And President Biden was one of those candidates, and he made good on a promise that President Trump had made. He had signed an agreement to leave from Afghanistan in May of last year, and President Biden managed to extend that to make it a slightly more orderly, but still equally disastrous kind of withdrawal, according to the critics of how the US left Afghanistan. So both Iraq and Afghanistan have occupied the US attention, but now the focus is shifting primarily to domestic economy and the pandemic, which has not let up. And so the costs of the disease have really occupied the lawmakers in Congress as well as at the state and local levels. I think this will be a determining factor of US foreign policy going forward. Of course, the government is still talking of competing with China, facing up to Russia, particularly on the Ukraine, trying to get its allies on board. But I think that will probably be a secondary importance coming into election year in the midterm elections this fall.
Mm-hmm. But Mr. Nawaz, if you look at this military budget of the United States, I think it's about $750 billion. That's probably larger than the next 9, if not 10 countries combined together.
Yes, and that has always been the case. And that's because the US has had a very powerful overseas presence because of its regional command structure and the way that it has approached the globe. So, and that will continue, at least for the time being. Mm-hmm. The new strategy that we see emerging, I mentioned the Quad originally. The new strategy is to form kind of local regional alliances, to use regional surrogates, to work with them. But the US will be prepared to enter zones if there are conflicts, or will try and coordinate economic policy with regional hegemons or groups of countries. So, for instance, with Europe, they're threatening not just to use military force in case Russia invades the Ukraine, but also to bring the weight of sanctions from the United States as well as Europe on Russia.
Mm-hmm. Well, Speaker, for the U.S. presidency in the Middle East, or the U.S. Military budget over there, people would wonder what's the U.S. purpose. At least part of the purpose is said to be, to plant the seed of democracy, the U.S.-style democracy in the Middle East. If that's the effort, do you see that kind of effort has been successful?
That's a question that is often debated, particularly in the United States and particularly in Congress when funding issues come up for the National Endowment for Democracy or for other congressionally funded organizations that include the International Republican Institute or the Democratic Institute that are also funded by the Congress. And the Congress also funds think tanks that are looking at these issues. So yes, these are debated, these are looked at, but these organizations have a long history. Now we're talking of 20, 30 years, where they've tried to educate people on voting rights, on the ability to vote, to set up private enterprises, for instance. I know, for instance, in the case of Pakistan, there's a group that is funded by the National Endowment for Democracy that tries to help private enterprises get into business so that they are a necessary part of any economy at the ground level. So you're not just investing in large infrastructure or large businesses. So in Africa, they're doing the same, and the same in South America. So this is a global effort. I don't think that it can change the way countries perceive the United States. And I think sometimes too much is expected of such efforts, including the use of bilateral aid. It never really wins friends. It is only over time that you build a relationship of trust with other countries, and that is critical. For that, you have to be consistent and clear in your vision as well as your actions.
And of course, if you look at this anti-terror war, we mentioned about the situation in Iraq. But if you look at this situation in several countries, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, the Philippines, Libya, and Syria, according to the Brown University research, at least 38 million people from these 8 countries have been displaced because of the anti-terror war. In Syria alone, more than 11 million people were forced to leave their homes in the past 11 years, creating this biggest humanitarian and refugee crisis. Do you think people, these songs, if you look at it, these are just numbers. Do they resonate with the people in America, think tanks, the officials in the government?
Yes, they do. But maybe not enough, I think, and that is the real point. The other thing is this, that it's very easy to blame one country, the United States, because it is the largest and the most active. But many of these conflicts are regional conflicts or internal conflicts or sectarian conflicts. And the United States goes in and without understanding the regional dynamics or the local dynamics, can sometimes make a situation worse. And I think that is the kind of introspection that is needed. And that's why people in Washington and in think tanks here, as well as people that I've spoken to in other parts of the country, are now asking these questions as to why is it that we don't understand what we're getting into, and why can't we get ourselves out when we realize that this is not our war? If other people are involved in it, let them resolve it. We should be a medium for resolution of conflicts, not to exacerbate their effects.
Well, let's have a break, and after this, we'll continue our discussion. Now joining me is Professor Faiz Zaland from Kabul University, Afghanistan. Welcome to the show, Professor. Well, we are talking about the U.S. involvement in the Middle East. Probably the first thing came to mind would be the wars the U.S. had or have against other countries like Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Libya. Indeed, America has been called a country of war, as it has been at war in 227 out of its 245 years since 1776. So I wonder, what's your take on that?
Thanks. I think there was a big expectation with the Middle East, this Gulf Spring population, youngsters. They were thinking that the Arab Spring will bring a change in the governments, and that change will be for the goodwill of the region and also the population. But unfortunately, with the involvement of US NATO forces, that change has become a chaos. What is happening in Libya, what's happening in Yemen, what happened to Iraq, what's happening in Syria, these are all those humanitarian catastrophes, chaoses, which has dealt with thousands and millions of people been displaced, casualties, and killed. So U.S. recently, the international relation that U.S. is leading by realism, by war and visions, it has created a lot of devastation. What happened in Korea War and Vietnam, and then Somalia and Balkans, and then now in Afghanistan. These are all those areas where U.S. failed its visions, and it has created a lot of human catastrophes.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, if you take a look at this, the legacy of the U.S. involvement in the Middle East as it shifts its attention to Asia, or some would say they are trying to withdraw from this region, probably it's time to take a look at their legacy. But one of the legacy probably is, the victims of war. That means, civilians, the loss of the lives of civilians. According to one figure, over 387,000 civilians have died violent death as a direct result wars by the U.S. In the past 20 years since 9/11, probably 2001. And also, latest case, or recent case, I would say, in Afghanistan, in Kabul, the drone strike. So you see the killing of 10 civilians, including 7 children. But then the response from the Pentagon is, oh, it's a, quote, honest mistake, and no one would be punished for that. I mean, as someone living in Kabul, what's your response to that?
I think it's human rights violation. It is not a message from a democratic country, a country which thinks that this is the motherland of democracy. Democracy means respect for people. For the people is wishing their freedoms and rights. But we see with all these invasions and these bombardments and these drones, what happened in Afghanistan and then what happened in Iraq and Syria and Yemen. These are all those big human rights violations that US have committed. I think the court, the Hague Court, the International Court for looking after such kind of violations, should deal with these, and UN, United States, and then Human Rights, United Nations, and then Human Rights Council should look after such cases. In Afghanistan, it is not the only one case in Kabul. There were so many cases in Kandahar and Shindan and Kunal and Host. Such violations happen, and they are like Afghan people are still wishing the international communities, the international organization, that they will look after such cases. Investigation will be there, and those people who committed such crimes, they must be trialed.
Mm-hmm. So the Afghan people are still waiting for answer or for accountability. But if you look at this, I would say, response from the Pentagon, they did investigate the case and they produced a report. According to the report, it found no violation of law, including the law of war. And then a lot of people expressed their concern that such a report would actually contribute to this sense of impunity, and probably it will contribute to the failure to address the issue of systematic killing of civilians. In particular with the drone strikes, so making future civilian casualties inevitable. Do you agree with that kind of concern?
Yeah, for sure. Look, if we are making other people, other governments, other nations accountable and responsible for committing crimes against humanity, then how can we ourselves be human violators? How can we be the people who created or who are part of the biggest impunities of the century? So making responsible, for example, in the case of Afghanistan, the Taliban now, they are in de facto government authorities, making them responsible for human rights. If we, as a country like US or West, they committed the crimes, they are not looking after that. So what are they messaging? What are they messaging to Afghans, the locally, and then to the rest of the world? What the message they are echoing? Such kind of activities and such kind of decisions, such kind of commitments, it really echoes that it doesn't matter to violate the human rights outside of US, but anybody who is committing crimes against Westerns, if that is American or Western country members, then that be a crime. Rest of the world is not a crime if we kill, if we bombard, if we extrajudicially trace them.
Mm-hmm. Well, another issue, I would say, the disastrous outcome would be probably the culture, the history. One notorious case was the looting of the Iraqi National Museum after the nation was invaded by the United States in 2003. Some 15,000 antiquities were looted over there. And then I would say that's a loss to Iraq. That's a loss probably to the entire Muslim world, because that's about the religion, that could be about the history, I would say cultural treasures. So that's kind of like invisible because that's not about the loss of lives of civilians. So what are this kind of cultural damage mean to Iraq or to this Muslim world?
I think it's a big concern. It has departed the Muslim world from being alliance with US and their allies in the region. Many of these nations like Iraq, for example, now Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, these countries, they hate any Western, specifically US. They do not want US and their allies to be in their country or come back for any kind of the slogans which were made, good governance, human rights, women rights. They were all fake slogans just to intervene in the very national assets and the very national prides of these countries. So it's a big burden on the so-called democracy and their slogans that they have been making around the world for supporting women rights, human rights, this and that. It only create a vacuum. It has created only a hatred in these nations and countries, and it has never messaged human rights support.
But let's focus a little bit on the Iraq war. You know, this destroyed this country on many fronts. There's one figure, after 2003, Iraq's GDP never got back to the level of 1990. And prior to the 1990, 97% of the urban dwellers, 71% of the rural population in Iraq had access to free primary health care. But now, a population of 1.8 million people have to share less than 1,000 hospital beds. Then there's zero accountability about this illegal war against a sovereign country.
Yeah, you know, that's why US, NATO, they failed in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's why they received a defeat. You know, what is happening now in Iraq government, what's happening in their parliament, what are they asking? They're asking the very footprint of US should be taken away from the country. You know, what's going on in Iraq, like day-to-day disruption of civil services, day-to-day disruption of the civil economy and all those things and the infrastructure. It has all gone into ruin. It has all been damaged and destroyed. So that is what the real result is. Like when we say this external state building process is taken lead by US and then their allies, not only in the current 21st century, but also in 20th century. They were all loots, they were all impunities, they were all fake slogans, they were all human rights destructions, they were all catastrophes. So those catastrophes, that history is still there, and we don't see any lesson learned from all these biggest mistakes against human rights.
Mm-hmm. Professor Zaland, you know, according to the U.S., you know, at least part of their purpose of their engagement in the Middle East is to plant the seed of democracy, in particular the U.S.-style democracy. If that's true, do you think that kind of effort has been successful?
Oh, like how can we say that? For example, we don't have democracies there. Second, anything which is copy-pasted, it is a failure. Third, the rights and the values that we impose on people, like in Afghanistan or Iraq and Syria, it will never work. You know what happened in 20 years in Afghanistan, the invasion, it strengthened it, more empowered Taliban rather than Republicans. Now, 20 years, finally they gave all the weapons, the drones, and all these Humvees, the very US M16, M14, and the snipers, and all these weaponaries, and more than billions of dollars weaponaries to Taliban. Taliban were not having any of such weapons and such kind of treasury 20 years before, but US invaded and they left all these very developed ammunitions and weaponry to Taliban. So Taliban become powerful, empowered by the US invasion. The same is happening now in Iraq and Syria and Yemen and Lebanon and those countries where US invaded, and then they empowered the extremists, or they empowered those people that they fought against, or they empowered those structures authorities that they never believed in democracy. So the democracy has lost its value. The democracy has lost its copy-pasted, approach to these countries.
Well, another issue, of course, right after 9/11, in particular, when the U.S. launched this anti-terror war, more or less, it's about, the people do see a lot of wars against Muslim countries. So, people would say there's a cultural war over Islam or against Muslim countries. Every time when flares up, there's a terror attack or there's other forms of violence, then involving Muslims, it will hit the headlines. So it produced this kind of perception or impression. There's a war against Islam, over Islam against the Muslim countries over there. Do you agree with people? Do you see a cultural war, over Islam or Muslim people?
I think what we have been going through past 20 years, specifically in Afghanistan, it was somehow people perceive, generally the nation perceive that all these values, they are not been respected. They are not the values intrigued in Islamic culture or Afghani culture. The same what we have been hearing and listening to Iraq, and the same thing happens there, imposing a very Western style of living, the very Western style of conducting the civil servants and all these things. But, each nation is recognized by its own values, culturally, historically, politically, and then economically. Now, imposing such kind of values itself is an invasion. It is itself anti-human rights violation, and it's still a crime. So those crimes have been committed in many of these countries, what we have been referring.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a very good point. You said that every country has its own tradition, its own practice, its own culture. But if you look at the U.S. approach, the foreign policy largely from the West, they would say, oh, there's a universal value. That is democracy, that is freedom. Usually, it's a Western-style democracy. Western-style, you can say, freedoms. Sometimes they would impose those kind of values on countries, on foreign countries. So that kind of practice, of course, produces the problem. Do you see that?
Yeah, universal value, the very biggest universal value accepted all over the world in universe is the independence. The independence to live in a country, independence for having a right of expression, living the way, having its own. When you take off the independence of a country and nation, you actually violate any other values. You violate even the democracy if you take the independence of a country. If there is an independent democratic country and you invade that, you have taken their independence and you have taken their other rights. So with all these invasions, for example, what happened in Afghanistan, Iraq, and what's happening in Syria, the very first right of human being, the independence, that has been taken. So it really violates everything else.
Mm-hmm. Well, overall, if you look back over the past decades or couple of decades, I would say, of the U.S. engagement in the Middle East, including in your country, of course, what kind of comment you would give to the overall performance of the U.S. policy in this region?
It should be a lesson learned. We should rethink of our international relation. We should value more human rights. We should value more nation rights. We should cooperate on economical basis. We should cooperate on very defined human rights activities rather than invading, copy-pasting, imposing all such rights without thinking about the recipients of it.
Well, thank you, Professor Zaland. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Qin Duo. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.